Hello, good evening to everyone. Thank you for joining me. I'm Dr. Philip McMillan, and I have been talking to scientists and experts since 2020, all around COVID vaccines and COVID and the science around COVID. And so I continue in that trajectory with a conversation today with Nicolas Hulscher, and I'll introduce him in just a minute. Now, in case you don't know, this is going to be a challenging conversation because I suspect that some of the things that he's going to say will irritate those who are very much pro what happened in terms of the pandemic. My job here is to try and understand, to help to bring his ideas and concepts into your understanding, to bring the challenge that I suspect some other people would put if they were talking to him, and somehow try and see if we can get a balanced view on everything that's said. So it's a tremendous pleasure to have him here. So without further ado, Nicholas, can you do a quick introduction to yourself?
Yes, my name is Nicolas Hulscher. I'm an epidemiologist at the McCullough Foundation. And ever since 2023, I've now contributed to the publication of over 20 peer reviewed scientific manuscripts looking at the adverse event profile of the COVID 19 vaccines.
So, listen, you are going straight in at one of the most controversial aspects of the pandemic. But before we get into that, I'm very curious as to what your trajectory was in terms of pre all of this, before you got into the McCullough Foundation and so on. What were you doing at the time?
Yeah, so I was actually going to the University of Michigan School of Public Health in 2023 up until 2024. And when this all began was we needed an internship at the University of Michigan for a research project, right? And so what did I do? I emailed over 50 professors to try and get an internship. Not one responded or accepted me for a role. And so I was like, you know what? If my own school is not going to accept me, why don't I reach out to somebody who I've been watching over the pandemic era, which was Dr. Peter McCullough. And I was a big fan of the research he was doing, and I thought maybe he would have something for me. And so I did email him for an internship, and he reached out back in about 5 minutes with an entire study idea, with literally entire study idea. And what this study was would end up being the systematic review of autopsy findings after COVID vaccination. And so from that point on, at the heart of the University of Michigan, I was investigating serious adverse events with these vaccines, which was basically a outlawed topic at university, especially at that time.
So, listen, what made you in the first place follow along with Dr. McCullough? Because early in the pandemic, he was talking about things like early treatment. He was supportive of things like hydroxychloroquine, which they discounted. He was talking about things like ivermectin. What made you connect with that?
Yes, yes. Well, I'll say right when the pandemic began in 2020, while I was actually, I was just finishing up undergraduate university with a bachelor's in pre-health professional studies. So all the basic biologies, health sciences, and right in January of 2020, when all of this started to become announced, I had some grave suspicions of, why is the whole world locking down in lockstep? Why is all this happening? Why? And then we move on to the summer months. Why are they only pushing certain drugs? Why are they attacking drugs that have been shown to work, at least preliminary? by doctors reporting real success in patients, by doctors publishing studies, like you said, on hydroxychloroquine. All this was showing promise, and yet they were just relentlessly trying to censor it. And that's when I was like, okay, something is off. And then we see in April of 2020 when they announced what the vaccines will be and how they'll work. And I remember reading an article, I believe it was in Popular Mechanics, one of those magazines, and they were saying how it's going to turn your cells into a factory to make proteins using a genetic code of the spike protein. And so that's when, I was like, okay, something's wrong. And I started following Dr. McCall. I started following all these other frontline doctors that were trying to tell the truth, getting censored. And so that's how I got attached to them.
So, in effect, from the start, you had questions. Were you an outlier in the context of your family or your colleagues and so on? Where did you fit in that?
My family has been 100% supportive. So I have not been an outlier in my direct family. There are some friends and some other family that, do not align with any of this. But regarding my colleagues and other fellow students while I was at school, I was an extreme outlier. And so basically, since I was doing that autopsy review paper at the school, right, I had to talk to my professors. I had to talk to people about this. And I was warned that I would have no career if I continued to do this. And so what I did was I actually ended up presenting these autopsy findings at the epidemiology poster session. And I had many professors, they would just walk past me. They wouldn't even look at me. They wouldn't even look at me, my own professors. So it angered many people. And then the people that did come to look acted like thought there was no such thing as serious adverse events after a genetic product. And so it shocked many people. It made many people angry. And it was a very interesting experience.
When you think about that, because it's a lonely road you took. It is a lot easier to just go along, even if you personally or quietly think this is an issue. And this is what many people did, is that they just didn't let anybody know that they had questions. They just went along as best as they could. You took a clear stance in that instance to challenge the narrative. And this is what I'm saying. I'm trying to understand, when you would have known this at the time that this was a risk, what made you still push through?
Yeah, well, I would say before I went in to the School of Public Health, one of the main reasons I wanted to go into the School of Public Health, into public health in general, and into epidemiology was because I was very disturbed by what was happening with the public health situation, right? Because this was in 2022, when I decided to go in. So I was already very concerned. That was one of the drivers to want to get me in, to help change what has been ongoing and what has been riddled with corruption and bias. And so, since that was one of the main drivers, I did not want to give up, and I wanted to do what I thought was the right thing and report on it anyways, despite the severe backlash and outcasting and academic bullying.
And when you think about it, very rarely do people do something like that in just a one-off moment. You must have done this before. What had you done before this that challenged the narrative, that made you not afraid, or it became your persona to stand up?
Yes, yes. Well, I'll tell you, back in seventh grade, in literature class, I had to write a scientific paper on something I found interesting or, groundbreaking or really anything about science, and it had to be like a manuscript, right? Where you write a sentence and you give a reference, you write another sentence, you give a reference, you have to reference everything you say. And so what my paper was on the possible link between vaccines and autism, and that was back in seventh grade. This was a long time ago. So I ended up getting a B plus on it, right? All of the references were peer reviewed, and so yeah, I began kind of being very skeptical of the safety of injectable products a long time ago. And so I kind of wasn't afraid as I grew older to kind of speak out against it.
You are going to be a challenge to those around you. That's going to be one heck of a challenge. But listen, so one of the things that you started off with, and I think that people need to grasp how important this is that you were starting with autopsy studies. Now, people don't quite understand that the whole foundation of Western medicine is on the foundation, the basis is on autopsy research. This is how we know and understand disease. For some reason, we have less pathologists, and certainly in the pandemic, there was some reduction in terms of autopsies because it had to only be done in a level 3 facility. And then when we hit the vaccines, it's like autopsies stopped. And for many people, they don't know that literally every 2 weeks or so, I go through Google Scholar searching just for the word autopsy, any histological patterns. And so I can tell that these are just not being done. So the work that you guys were focused on in terms of autopsies and in terms of what is happening with the heart and so on was really, really critical. What was it, the first paper you were working on? What was what was the focus there?
The focus was to collect and synthesize every single peer-reviewed published autopsy report where of deaths after COVID vaccination. So the inclusion criteria was, did they get a vaccine and did they have an autopsy? And so all of that was included. It could have been a case report, could have been case series where it's many cases, and we found every single one using validated Prisma systematic review methodology. And so we had all of them. And so the main purpose was to see, is there a possibility of a causal link between these products and death? And the answer, based on there was about 240 cases that we were able to adjudicate based on the autopsy findings and findings with corroborating research in the VAERS system. There was 240 deaths that we were able to assess with as having a possible link to the vaccine. And so based on that large number of deaths via well established causes, at least now here in 2025, we did assess there was a high likelihood of a causal link between the products and death.
One of the challenges you will face, and I've seen it and heard it quite often, is they'll say, okay, that's 240 cases. Even if we gave you that, and that all of these were vaccine related, they have given billions of doses of the vaccine. And so what that means in terms of percentage is that it's no big thing, tiny fraction that would have been affected with adverse responses. What would you say to that?
Yes, well, I would say to that is nearly almost a vast majority of deaths after COVID vaccination first do not get an autopsy. And if they do get an autopsy, they won't be uploaded as a case report to the peer reviewed literature. That's all rare. And you have biased publishers that won't publish those findings. It's very hard to get that published, especially if you say it was linked to the vaccine. So you have all the mechanisms working against you, and you have very few autopsies being conducted in the first place. So it's not, this does not give a representation of how many deaths there really are. This is simply us seeing what has happened to the deceased. And there is very clearly going to be a much larger number than what was identified as case reports published.
Yeah, I think you're quite right with that. I remember seeing a study that really stood out to me. I did a whole presentation on it where they just looked back at patients who had been vaccinated and then had PET scans done, and they looked at the heart. And there was a very clear indication that there was a significantly higher risk of glucose uptake, which indicates potentially inflammation in the heart. They couldn't specify the cause. And this was easily, I think, about 30%. And so one of the big issues is around the fact that without autopsy data, we have no idea as to how many people could be being affected. And it's not necessarily whether or not someone dies of it. It's just the fact that first you have to recognize that it is a pathological pattern that needs to be followed. Why do you think that it is so difficult for researchers to publish on this? It can't be that they are not interested, but they are certainly not publishing.
Right. They're afraid to lose their jobs. They're afraid to lose their jobs at universities and medical centers. They're afraid to be outcasted by their colleagues, by their friends. And so every incentive is for them to not publish on it because they don't want to lose their livelihoods. And that has caused a catastrophic void in the literature for adverse events in high level journals. So you'll see most of the adverse event papers, they're not in New England Journal of Medicine. In fact, there's literally almost none in that journal. They won't be in the Lancet. They won't be in JAMA, right? It just won't be there. What will be in those journals is clinical trials with authors and funding by Pfizer and Moderna. That's what will be in those journals. And so, one thing that has become clear over the pandemic is there appears to be an academic publishing cartel that does not allow research to be published in these top journals that speak against the narrative. And it's not just with vaccines, it's also was with hydroxychloroquine. Many of those papers got retracted for no plausible reason. And so they retract these papers. They even retract preprints, right? They retract preprints. We just had a preprint retracted last week, which is it's just unheard of. It's ridiculous. It's made to share preliminary information. There's no reason to just wipe it completely based on literal nonsense. So they
So
do
let me,
that.
I just want to catch you there. So, in effect, so let's just so that the public understands this. So, you've done a paper, it is due to be reviewed by a journal where peer reviewers go and look through it, and they will then say that you need to fix this or you fix that, or they challenge different points, and you go through the peer review. So, you are saying that there are people who don't even want it to get to the preprint stage where it can't even be seen to be published.
Right, exactly. They don't want it to be seen by anybody. They just want it censored, buried, and that's it. They want to wipe out the credibility of the study before it can make it to peer review because they realize if a preprint shows up as withdrawn, it's going to be very difficult to get a journal to accept it because they're going to ask, well, why was this withdrawn? And so, who appears to be central to this debacle is what's called PubPeer. It's a platform where so called scientific sleuths, that's what they call themselves, go and contact the editors of journals and blast out all sorts of so-called issues they identify with the editors of these journals, and they're relentless. They do it, it appears, full time, for sure, full time. In fact, because we receive messages every day, that every day we get a new message from PubPeer of somebody identifying some so-called error, and they relay this to the journals. And the journals, almost all of them now, we have identified recently. It was Taylor and Francis. Recently, Kevin McKernan and his paper related to DNA contamination was published a few weeks ago. There's now an expression of concern. It's now under investigation. They're trying to retract it now because this PubPeer mob did contact the editors. And that's what we saw again with our preprint we were just talking about on transcriptomic harms after these products. It's the same group, the same individuals. PubPeer was central to contacting MDPI, the hosting platform of preprints.org, and got this paper removed. And this is very dangerous. And this is exactly why the DOJ is now investigating the top journals, New England Journal of Medicine, Lancet, JAMA, and they actually sent letters to them, asking them, why do they have so much bias and fraud, and why are they censoring all of this? So it's now going to get to a point where key people, at the levels of decision making in America are aware of these illicit activities censoring critical pharmaceutical safety data. They are now aware of it. And so all those individuals doing this, it may not be wise to continue to do so.
This is quite significant when we think about the implications. So I just recently did a post, and it was about the fact that which product was it? Azelitine, which is an antihistamine. They found that the nasal spray would reduce infection and symptoms around COVID. Now, I was reflecting on the fact that early in the pandemic, somebody like Dr. Shetty, and I know Dr. McCullough and Dr. Shetty, they know each other quite well. He was using quite early antihistamines and steroids. And that strategy was implemented in Meghalaya, a whole region in India, with great outcomes. And I just reflected and I thought to myself, his research was suppressed. It was discounted. How many millions of lives could have been saved if those strategies had broadly been implemented?
Right. So this is where we get to the point where actually, if none of this censorship took place and they allowed frontline doctors to share their critical findings, to share what they found in their hundreds and thousands of patients they've treated, if we allowed them to do that, that would have saved probably millions of lives. Not like what they're claiming now save millions of lives, right? And so, yeah, it has cost human lives to suppress this information in favor of certain products that they were pushing. It has cost lives. It was very dangerous. It still is very dangerous to suppress this. People may not think it's very serious to, slap a retraction note on a paper, but it is very serious. It is very, very, very serious.
One of the papers that came out from Japan, and this is fitting in with the cardiac thing, was this new condition, multiple microscars. So in Japan, they were just at a pathological conference. They were looking at people who had died in an unusual pattern with cardiac arrhythmias. So they did detailed histology and found multiple tiny little scars scattered throughout the heart. Now, it was only 3 patients. And so straight away, somebody can say, well, it was only 3 patients. But my question is, if that can be happening to one cohort of people, the question should be, is this occurring very broadly across the population? Is it potentially connected to issues like increased risk of atrial fibrillation, ventricular arrhythmias, things that do seem to be increasing? And we would never know this if we weren't, or if we don't do autopsy studies. And this is where the censorship comes with a really serious cost, because put aside for a second the fact that maybe the industry may be worried that, their product is under question. The far more serious point is that you cannot have people at high risk for conditions that could be identified and managed not being treated simply because no research is done.
Right, right. Well, when you mention the micro scars in the myocardiums of those individuals in that case report, they each of them did receive, I think, there's a range of 3 to 5 boosters. And so what's concerning about micro scars is they would not be detectable with conventional imaging, MRIs. You won't know if you have it unless you literally open up, go on the, operating table, and they open up your heart and look at it with a microscope. And so that's why that's so concerning. And that case served as a sentinel report, a warning report that should warrant further very, very massive, intensive investigations into seeing, well, how much of the population that received 4 or 5 boosters has these micro scars? How much? How do we prevent this sudden cardiac death from occurring? Is it because of the micro scars? None of that is being investigated. It's only being investigated by a small subset of researchers across the globe. But yeah, that paper is vitally important, and it does tie in directly with our work on cardiac arrest and subclinical myocarditis.
Absolutely. The two are very closely interconnected, but it then points right back into your industry with epidemiology, public health. There is a responsibility to the public, not to industry, not to government, but to the public. How can they justify not acting on that kind of information?
They can justify it with money. They can justify it by getting large sums of money and thinking we're rich now. We don't care. We're not going to investigate it. We just bought this massive yacht, and sorry, we're just going to censor your studies. We're not going to look into this. So that's what appears to be the case, unfortunately, because we at least know here, or at least we know of the major publishers. Some of their main donors are Pfizer, Moderna, these publishing companies. About half of editors and peer reviewers receive money from big pharma, right? So they all, I mean, this is a very entrenched issue of monetary compensations to not do this. And
I
again, yeah.
understand. Yeah, I understand that bit that you said with regards to, say, the top people in the industry. Say, for instance, being influenced in some way, but that's not who I'm talking about. I am talking about the fact that across the world, so it's not just the United States, all over the world, they have public health departments. And those public health departments are supposed to be acting for the interest of their public. And believe me, they are not getting a cent from anything that is happening. My question is, why are they not asking the hard questions?
It appears because then they would be complicit in the actions over the past 4 years, because it's gone on for so long, right? For 4 years now, they have been pushing universal mRNA injection, even in very almost no risk groups such as 6 month olds. They've been doing that. They've reached a point where it will be very difficult to reverse without facing serious backlash. And we also have to remember some individuals are under what's called um, mass psychosis since 2021, where they will simply not be able to psychologically question that things may be different than what their worldview has been for such a long period of time. So and they have also, in some individuals, when you do take, 5, 6, now 7 of these products, of these gene transfer platforms, when you take that many, that will make it extremely difficult to kind of realize that that may have been a catastrophic mistake for your health, and a catastrophic mistake for those who you recommended it to. So there's so many things psychologically going on that may explain this. But yeah, it's a great question. These products are still available basically in all of the Western world, and there's almost no investigations into vaccine injury other than recent ones here in the U.S. that are very small investigations, but at least they're doing it.
And when we think about what the ACIP was discussing yesterday, so they have made some adjustments in the United States with regards to their recommendation for COVID vaccines. And now they have shifted it from a recommendation broadly in adults to having it as a discussion with their doctor. Now, I, for one, I'm thinking to myself, hold on, have you given doctors any specific training or information about how to make this risk benefit decision? Are we now just passing it on? So now the patients will come to us and say, should I get the vaccine? And if there are any issues, are they now my responsibility as a clinician? Is that kind of thing that is happening? What are your thoughts with regards to the decisions that they have made at this point?
Right, right. So yeah, we saw yesterday they did vote to end universal COVID shot recommendations. And yeah, it is now shared clinical decision making for all age groups, which means it is now in the hands of the physician, of the pharmacist, to decide whether they should get the vaccine or not. Now, it is a step obviously in the right direction, but it's still concerning that certain physicians and pharmacists that may not understand the full safety profile of these shots could still subject a 6 month old to this technology. That's what still very much concerns me. And we have to remember they talked about that ACIP meeting, DNA contamination, right? About over 600 times above the safety limits, right? So we have to remember peanut peanut bars or protein bars contaminated with peanuts get removed from the market quickly, right? They identify that that's out. When it comes to gene products with DNA plasmid fragments, SV40, and spike encoding fragments, that doesn't matter to them, right? That just stays there. That's fine. Don't look there. So that's where we're at this point in time. But yeah, definitely going in the right direction. There was a very unfortunate vote where they're actually going to make it prescription only to get the COVID shot. You would need a prescription. It was a 6-6 tie, and unfortunately, it did not pass due to the ACIP chair voted no. So it was a no. So that would have been plausible. But what appears to be the plan is, instead of a market withdrawal, which I think definitely should happen. Instead of a market withdrawal, they're going towards a slow phase out process. And the next step appears to be, now, since these physicians will be responsible for these injections, they will have to provide proper informed consent with the massive list of risks on it, including things that are very, very bad. And so that patients will be forced to read that. They'll be forced to have to consent to that. And so that appears to be their trajectory.
One of the things that I think, and as I said, I've been following this for a long time, and I've always been concerned about spike protein autoimmune responses. So even early in the pandemic, I was concerned that, make sure you limit this to high risk people who weren't infected. And so I wasn't against them using it, but I thought it needed to be quite significantly restricted in terms of who got it. Actually, as I said previously, I think if they had done that, they would have not had these issues coming up, because the pandemic would have been over and it would have appeared that this was the miracle solution. So in some sense, they've shot themselves in the foot by broadly using it across the population. However, now here is my thought, and I'll put this to you, because I know you believe blanketly they must take them off the market. My thought is that I know that they're driving IgG4 responses, and IgG4 is kind of like immunosuppressive. So they're acting like a kind of dose of hydroxychloroquine or something similar for a few months, and therefore reducing the risk of severe responses on reinfection. If they pull it completely and they are not replacing it with any other strategy, that concerns me. What would you say to that?
Yeah, and that's what concerns a lot of people, and maybe the reason why it has not been removed from the market, because they would have to replace it with an alternative for people to take. Now, obviously, many doctors, many physicians would just say, just do early. If you get COVID now at this point in time, it's very mild. Just getting on an early treatment protocol, and do all the proper steps, and your risk of serious damage or death is very, very low. That's what they would say. But that's what raises the importance of finding and intensively investigating alternatives that are safe, not experimental, not genetic. And so, with the amount of resources the governments have, they could have found an alternative years ago, right? They could have. And what they should do, though, is they should implement recommendations for these early treatment protocols. They haven't done any of that. They have not consulted any of the frontline physicians on this. And so there's so many things they could do in the interim. But the problem is with the mRNA, we've just identified so many different fundamental biological issues um, in human beings that cannot be resolved. It appears, with maybe 100 years down the line, the future iterations could be targeted and not have ribosomal frame shift errors, and not go in the brain and the heart. Maybe they can do that in 100 years, but at this point in time, it's not looking good. It's not looking good at all.
Yeah, this is a challenge in that, as I objectively looked at the platform and the more information that I got, and as I said to people, you have to remember that very early on, I first interviewed Robert Malone. So can you hear me still? Yes.
Yep, you're back.
Yeah.
You're back.
Yeah. Sorry. Yes, he was the one who had that idea with regards to the technology. And even he had doubts with regards to how it could be implemented. So when you think about that and some of the characteristics, recently I spoke with a Christy Grace who was looking at the principle of adduction, where some of the lipid nanoparticles themselves, the ionizable lipids, if they become charged, they can then change proteins if they come into contact with them. Quite significant issues that haven't even been investigated. So there are a lot of holes that need to be plugged. But when I think objectively about it, I can potentially see, as you said, if they iron out some of those things, I can see, okay, this certainly can help if you're trying to get RNA into tissues, like for instance in cancer. I think that this certainly has the potential to be quite useful, but I'm still not completely convinced that they can use it at this point as a standard vaccine. I think that that really does need a lot more work. And because of how they're pushing it, they're likely to destroy the whole platform, similar to what happened to a drug that was completely destroyed in the 1960s, thalidomide, when in effect they just needed not to use it in pregnant women. But in men, in many other conditions, it's a good drug, but it's destroyed. Its reputation has been destroyed because it was used in the wrong cohort. I suspect we're going to face a similar thing now. Any thoughts on that?
Yes, yes. Gene therapy at this stage in development is just it just doesn't seem ready for human use, right? Because it's not just the mRNA shots, it's muscular dystrophy gene therapy, and a lot of individuals that are getting these in clinical trials, they're dying and they're dying quickly. And so it's not working out very well at this point, and it's clearly not ready, in my opinion, for human use, particularly the mRNA platform. It's not ready for human use. It's been administered billions of doses. We've uncovered what it has done molecularly now, which I'm not sure how that can be remedied. And so many different adverse events in multiple organ systems. It's simply now, I think it's just not safe for human use at this period of time.
One of the papers that you had said you had done, which got pulled, and I just wanted you to explain it to us about where there was a change in the genetic profile of the person. So just generally, in a way that won't get this censored, what were you guys trying to figure out?
We're trying to look at the what's called transcriptomic profiles of those who were injured by the pandemic products, by the genetic pandemic products. So what that means is, so transcriptomics is basically, the expression of your genes in kind of making proteins in your body, right? So it goes from genomics to transcriptomics to proteomics, and then up to biochemical, right? So you kind of start small, you go big. Transcriptomic is at the very base molecular level of how your body functions. And so we looked at 10 people who were injured. We looked at their transcriptomic profiles and we compared it to a large control group of pre COVID transcriptomic gene expression profiles that were unaffected by any form of synthetic spike protein, whether from infection or not. And so we identified severe, and actually over thousands of gene expressions did become dysregulated. So in about 7 of these individuals, they did develop new onset malignancies shortly following product administration, and 3 of them developed cardiovascular neurological sequelae after the products. And so we identified, so what were the main categories of gene expressions that were disrupted? Have to do with, one is mitochondrial functioning, specifically the genes related to electron transport chain complex 1 were thrown out of whack. And then we also had cancer surveillance genes, P53 and BRCA were severely down regulated. So the body would have a much more difficult time kind of seeing if there's cancers and suppressing those cancers. And that's not a good thing. And then you had genes related to immune function were also being down regulated. And so we kind of saw this, what's called transcriptomic chaos in these individuals. And this is basically this is actually the first report that kind of reports it, but it was corroborated by a study that was peer reviewed a few weeks ago that found proteomic chaos. And what that means is the proteins were all deformed, right? They weren't functioning properly. There was signals of protein misfolding, and there was biochemical signals, including pro BNP, right? So it was indicated of cardiac damage. They found carbamide was up, indicative of kidney damage. They found inflammation markers were up as well significantly in the injected group, CRP. And so all of this molecular, the molecular landscape now is now being looked at, and it is not good. And we're going to continue to investigate that.
One of the questions that I'm sure you would be challenged on is how do you know that this is not from infection as opposed to just vaccination or the combination thereof? Because it would be very difficult to tease it out, wouldn't it?
Yes, yes, and that's true. That's true. That's the next question that needs to be answered. Could there have been some subclinical infections in these or asymptomatic infections? That's very possible. And so the main issue now is most people were exposed to the manufactured SARS-CoV-2, right? And so since they were all exposed to it, we do have to look at the combination of exposures now at looking at people's risk profiles. And so you're right, that's the next step that has to be looked at to differentiate, how much of it is from infection and how much of it is from inoculation. And that's a very difficult question to answer, but we're actually working on another study to try and answer that question.
I think one of the papers that I'd come across there was about the fact that the histones that the DNA is wrapped around. So in order for the genes to be used, they have to unravel these yo-yos almost of DNA with the histones. But it seems as though these histones are then being locked in position, so they can't re-wrap it up. And so you're having these segments of DNA that may be inflammatory, staying exposed and continuing to drive inflammation. And the study that did it found a clear link in terms of the COVID, the mRNA vaccines. So it fits with what you are describing. And that does make sense. I wouldn't be surprised. I think the important thing, though, is that for a vast majority of people, they wouldn't necessarily have these. It's a small proportion that would necessarily have this kind of pattern, but it's still a significant population group that we need to understand.
Right, right. Yeah, we need large patient populations and to really study all of this to see, how many people is it really affecting molecularly? What is it actually doing in a large subset of people? Because you're right, we're starting at these small sample sizes because we're not a government, we're not, a top university with millions and millions of dollars in funds, so it's very difficult to kind of gather these massive resources and massive amounts of cases. So we're starting at as much people as we can get, and as much as we can afford. And we're finding these extremely concerning molecular signals. So yeah, the next step needs to be there needs to be all hands on deck on this genetic molecular issue because it is very serious.
When you're doing this work, Nicholas, are you afraid that the questions being asked and the challenges being made are going to damage trust overall in science, public health, medicine? Is it worth it?
Trust has already been, in my opinion, almost irreversibly shattered in the scientific establishment among the general population. We now have a Rasmussen survey out of the United States that found 50%, 57% of US voters believe the COVID-19 genetic countermeasures caused mass deaths. So it's now the majority of Americans believe that most have lost trust. Even most healthcare workers here in the US have lost trust. There's about less than 20% booster uptake. They don't trust these products anymore. So it's going to, it cannot be brought back the trust until drastic changes are made that the people want. And so that's what is underway here at the United States. Other countries, it appears not so much. And this was worth it, though. Exposing these harms and exposing what has happened was worth the was worth alerting people to what's happening than to just worry about a collapse in trust, right? They shouldn't have done this. They shouldn't have pushed these products on 6 month olds. They shouldn't have done this. And now we are seeing the consequences.
When you think about it personally, Nicholas, because you are taking a stance right at the front, you are likely to be being targeted personally when you look on even on social media and so on. That must wear you down. Do you still have those moments of doubt where it just feels too heavy?
Not anymore. I did at the very beginning. I did when reading all those attacks, hateful comments, academic bullying at universities, saying how I would not have a career. All that stuff got to me for a brief moment. And I was like, you know what? This hurts, man. All these people hate me now. Like, really? This is crazy. I lost, some friends. But as time went on and as more and more of these harms became exposed, and as more and more people began to attack me, I mean, we're literally under nuclear attack of words at the moment. That's for sure. Now I've reached a point where it just deflects right off. Right, it just deflects like I have a mirror around me, and every time they say that I'm a shill, I'm killing people with this information. Every time they say that, it just bounces right off now, and I don't care. So yeah, I've grown over the years to not care what people say at all. Actually, at this point, because they say a lot of bad things now, a lot. And I realize that just comes with this exposure process, and as people appear to lose their minds as they realize what has happened.
And so imagine that RFK calls you up and says, you know, Nicholas, we like the work you're doing. We think it's important. We want you to try and direct where we go in terms of our focus. Are there about two or three things that you think are right at the top of the priority that needs to be addressed as soon as possible?
Yes, yes. One thing that they've already done, which is great, fantastic, was they diverted a lot of focus from almost solely infectious diseases. That's all they were basically looking at. They diverted a lot of those funds to chronic diseases, which affect over 60% of Americans here. We're so sick, the sickest country in the world. So that's huge, and that's obviously warranted. But now, what actually needs to happen is we have to look at the most recent mass exposure event, which was to the mRNA technology. And we have to try now and find out. And I would tell them, listen, we got to look at what these embalmers are reporting. We have to look in people's hearts. We have to issue guidance on how to prevent sudden death. We have to bring all of these injuries to awareness. And lastly, we got to start finding treatments to help these people. There's none. I mean, we've developed some, but there's no standardized methodology, no standardized treatment to vaccine injuries. They've been completely abandoned. And if we look at VAERS, we'll see the mass numbers. And we know that's underreported by a factor of about 30. So we see these mass numbers. We got to help these people. We can't ignore them. And we have to find the full scale of harms that has been incurred, or we're not going to get anywhere. We're going to keep suffering.
One of the things in medicine is the principle of the duty of candor, which is where we have to inform patients if harm has been caused by something. And it's a statutory duty. And when I reflect on it sometimes, I think about the fact that there are so many people who have actually had injuries and they are completely unaware that the two may be connected. They just know they're sick, they've got all kinds of problems, and it is highly likely that a good percentage of those people have been harmed by the vaccine. And so we need tools to be able to be more conclusive about saying, okay, based on these patterns, this is likely to be the cause, and this was likely to be when it happened. Do you ever think the political class, the public health class, the industry class will be open to that kind of openness and honesty?
With the current individuals, or at least past individuals here in America that were in place, it will be very difficult to be open to that. We are seeing immense resistance to trying to really open up the avenue to investigating any sort of harms when it comes to vaccines. Immense backlash. It has become a religion here. Vaccines, vaccine ideology. It has become a religion. And so, people who are ideologically compromised, it will be very hard for them to kind of be open to investigating vaccine injuries. So it appears that, we got to get people in these agencies that understand what may have happened and be open to possibilities and be open to the fact that when you inject something in somebody's body, there can be side effects.
Yeah, these are important discussions. So as we tie this up, Nicholas, as I said, when you look forward, and it's good to always have hope for the future, what would you think is the hope that the public should have for where we go in the future?
For the future, we want to have no corruption anymore. And I think the main issue is, it seems like many other countries are not making any changes at the moment except America. Our public health system here is undergoing drastic changes, and so our future is looking much very bright. And so I hope for the world that as we make these changes and as CDC starts to issue some more common sense principles, that this will trickle down worldwide and other countries will begin to follow. So there is a window now of opportunity to really change our trajectory in public health from corruption, censorship, and harms to healing, exposure, and being free from corruption. So we can have a very bright future ahead of us. That is 100% for sure. But the only way to do that is to address what has happened these past 5 years. And that has not really happened at all at a large scale. That needs to happen.
Brilliant. Excellent. Great way to end, Nicholas. Thank you very, very much for coming. Thank you for all the people. We have about 1,500 people with us live. So thank you all for being here. Thank you very much for all the comments and so on. I'm sure I'll have a chance to speak to you again in the future. So have a great day. Let's hope that RFK hears this and he does something about it. Um, I'd just like you to stay with me until after the outro. For all of you who are watching, look forward to our next upcoming presentations. I hope to speak with Gert in another week. So for those people who are asking, it should be coming. Have a great evening.